All right, welcome. I'm here with John Chalcraft, professor at the London School of Economics. Professor Chalcraft, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So we're speaking with regards to a 2018 essential reading you submitted on uprisings, resistance, and popular mobilization in the Middle East. A really great piece, part of a series for us. And so first, I feel unfair asking you this question with such a kind of limited amount of time we've given you, but what is the relevance for studying revolutions and uprisings in the Middle East for our current political moment?
Well, I think part of the key to this is thinking about the sort of context that we're in, which is that you had these very inspiring uprisings in 2011 in the Arab world in the name of bread, dignity, and freedom, millions coming out onto the streets. Then a sort of period of retrenchment, counter-revolution, forms of sectarianism, but you have ongoing protests, whether it's Iraq in Morocco or in Algeria or in Lebanon or Sudan or Iraq, and these are also keying into moments of popular struggle in other parts of the world, whether it's Black Lives Matter or transnational Palestine solidarity, But part of this context is that even though you have this quite upsurge of popular self-activity and popular struggle, the actual way it's translated into transforming state and society has been, there's been so many defeats and problems and disappointments. So part of studying uprisings, protests, and revolution right now is partly in this moment between sort of popular self-activity and revolutionary upsurge, but a huge difficulty, defeats, and problems in translating that into state and society, into economic, social, and cultural transformation. So it's almost that, it's this kind of, it's that problematic that sort of shapes the context for thinking about the study of revolutions and uprisings now. But it means there's a really urgent agenda around this issue.
Great, thank you so much. So then, we deal with questions of the canon. What amendments would you like to make to the canon on teaching uprisings and revolutions in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, okay, so yes, I mean, there are relatively familiar, relatively mainstream or liberal or Orientalist, neo-Orientalist ways of studying protest and social movements. And as you'd expect from someone like me, you've got to challenge, we have to challenge quite a lot of the sort of familiar forms of essentialism, exceptionalism, liberal assumptions about, sometimes, well, actually assumptions about the rationality of protest, because that's not good enough anymore. Once upon a time, that was useful for challenging Orientalism, but actually, protest comes in all kinds of forms, and it's not just about actors rationally pursuing their self-interest. That's one of these paradigms in social movement studies that we have to think very carefully about. So, but critical perspectives on popular protest, on uprisings that are historically engaged, that are interpretive, that don't pretend to objectivity, that are so engaged with the subject matter, engaged with sort of seeking transformation, often that use grounded methods like participatory action research or ethnography of one kind or another, and but that can take us beyond. I mean, there are several options in relatively progressive scholarship that we can work on, we can push back. I mean, there's problems with forms of post-colonialism and post-structuralism, problems of abstraction, of theorizing that's detached from the everyday lives and struggles of subaltern social groups and their urgent kind of politics. There are problems with classical Marxism, there have been for a long time, in the shape of materialism and teleology, and there's a kind of sterility that's crept into the field of contentious politics, social movement studies, even the newer iterations around strategic action perspectives and so on, which have become quite shapeless and give us less of a chance to interrogate forms of domination and how they can be transformed over time. So there's a lot to do in developing critical, praxis-oriented perspectives on protest and uprising. There's a hell of a lot to do. You think of, do we know now how to represent and analyze popular struggle in the academy? Do we actually know? To me, there's a lot to be done and a lot of exciting work to do to sort of push back, against some of the conventional modes of representation and forms of intervention. Because it has to be a kind of, when you study popular struggle, you have to also be intervening in some way. You can't just be pretending you're a clinician in a lab coat studying something that's out there. So that sense of engagement as well is I think, of vital importance.
Great. So 2 years ago, you put this essential reading out into the world. What I want to ask is, how would you like teachers, faculty members to use it as a pedagogical tool?
Oh, I think it can be used as an overview of important and good research in the field, a set of signposts as the terrain. It's introductory material for a course on resistance and protest, or if the course is just in Middle East studies in general, it might be to fill a gap in such a course. People, if you're writing an essay, doing a presentation, planning a dissertation, doing an assignment, it could be useful. Or you're thinking about how to frame new research projects. I think that as a tool could be useful. And of course, you don't have to be in a formal program. You can find it online. So those are some ways in which it could be used.
Absolutely. Great. And so my last question is, what are your hopes for the field of kind of studies on revolution and uprisings in the Middle East? What are your aspirations?
Well, the hopes for the field, pessimism of the intellect tells us that there are quite formidable obstacles to developing a kind of historically informed, critical, engaged, and progressive sort of research praxis on uprisings and revolution in the Middle East. You're not only out there in the real world, right-wing populism, imperialism, neoliberalism, the repression of research and education in the MENA, but also, and this has been felt very hard in Britain, is the marketization of the university and research. Quite big on my list that's a problem is the transformation of the research grant making structure into a kind of mind-numbing neoliberal bureaucracy. There's also the fact that in Middle East studies, in universities, that can be a conveyor belt that leads graduates into, government, security sector, ruling groups, or into middle-class punditry, or into top-down professionalized advocacy and development of human rights. Those aren't necessarily virtues. And you also have in other, some of the disciplines, the kind of rigor mortis of positivism, mechanical determinism, objectivism, that sort of takes its pound of flesh from Middle East studies when it sort of eats into the disciplines. And then you get, almost as a reaction on the other side, some very abstracted or purely normative forms of theorizing in cultural studies or post-structuralism. So those are, there's pessimism of the will there, of the intellect, but there's optimism of the will, that the popular struggles that I mentioned before since 2011, I mean, they're having their impact on the academy right now, and they're bound to, and you have new generations coming up, you have new movements. I think Black Lives Matter has made a difference, transnational Palestine solidarity. There must be ways in which universities can engage better with the sort of constituencies that are coming forward. You also have, the Middle East Studies Association of America has become more active and interesting in the last couple of years. And I should mention, I sit here in Britain. The British Society for Middle East Studies has gone through a very far-reaching transformation. I mean, this was a very conservative national association for Middle East Studies in Britain for a long period of time, and it's been transformed. I mean, one or two, at least two generations of progressive and engaged scholars and others have been excluded from that society, or they haven't been able to have an impact. But in the last couple of years, and especially around issues of BDS and Palestine, that's changed that society. And those things count. They don't change the world in a day, but they count for something. And there's always a what Gramsci would call a war of position in the universities, in that kind of organizational and cultural terrain. There are always struggles to be fought, even if they seem at the time that if you opt out of those struggles, then that's not a good legacy. So there's a battle. It's always a battle. I mean, perhaps one shouldn't expect anything else. You can't, and so the prognosis for developing a kind of historically minded and critically engaged studies of popular uprisings and protests in Middle East studies, it will depend, it'll depend on will and initiative, as well as on sort of, crushing conditions and difficult forces that we're bound to contend with, and that popular struggles also contend with.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much for having me.